Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. So this will be a video which Jordan Hall, Christopher, John Vervaeke, and myself will be entering into Dialogos. I just got done with the conversation, and all I can say is I feel filled with a sense of fullness and openness at the same time, directly in my heart, in my mind, and about our times. So in my experience, the reason why do go into Dialogos as a way of life really is exemplified through doing Dialogos. It's just a deep faith that seems super pertinent, but only forever in this time. A couple housekeeping things, like I've said before, my company, the Circling Institute, we've moved all of our teachings and our courses online. Links below. If you want to work one-on-one with me, just email me. My email's below. Enjoy. Also, had a plumbing crisis. So plumbers were in the back, and so that got in the way a little bit in the beginning. So I hope it doesn't distract too much, but I had to go back and forth. So a few technical difficulties. All right, enjoy. 3. Gentlemen.
Good to see all of you again. Very good to see all of you again. So I proposed in the email we sent around that we use this 4-way Dialogos to try and follow up on the 2 dialogues that Jordan and I had, centering around the notion of something like a Socratic faith. And Chris and I also recently had a very good discussion with Andrew Sweeney around this. And so these 3 discussions are very much on my mind right now, and what Socratic faith might look like and why it might be needed here in our current situation. Jordan and I have been exploring that, and what its relations are to closely attending notions such as wisdom, aspiration, and perhaps also the religion that's not a religion. These are all the things I I propose that we might sort of put on the table for discussion right now. How does that sound for the rest of you for today?
That sounds really good. And in weaving in with that, which actually I think maybe makes what you're talking about more salient and more pertinent, which is something that's really stuck with me. And I think he just said it out of just spontaneously, or just in finding his speech in one of his videos. Johannes said, he remarked something like, it's kind of funny being a philosopher where a philosopher has something to say that's actually timely. And that's really sunk in, this sense of that we're in a time right now that it may be such that what a philosopher says speaks to the time that we're in a direct way.
I think so. I think I was with Peter Lindbergh is creating an online Stoa, and I was asked to speak. I think, Jordan, you did yours today. Didn't you do another situational?
I did. Yeah.
So the one I did last night was on the meaning kairos and what this might be doing to shake, kairos is Tillich's notion, drawn from Neoplatonic Christianity, of timing, of a sense of a constellation of events that make radical transformation. So for extended periods of time, a system is very stable. It has a lot of inertia. It's very resistant to significant change. But in kairos, the conditions come together. It's analogous. It's not the same, but it's analogous to criticality in complex systems theory. The conditions constellate in such a way that radical change is possible. And part of what Jordan and I were talking about is the kind of knowing and the kind of faith, perhaps, that is relevant to being able to pick up on kairos. And The reason why I mention this to you guys, because I think Tillich thought that notion, at least it seems to be in his own work, he's exemplifying it, is where the philosopher and the prophet in the Old Testament sense, not in the foreteller of the future, but the philosopher and the prophet, and of course there are figures that embody both. Nietzsche comes readily to mind, Heidegger comes readily to mind, right? The philosopher prophet is a particularly pertinent individual during these times of Kairos. And I think Johannes's notion of how we are collapsed back onto, the subjectivity that has been so valorized and raised to such a huge metaphysical level in our culture, only to find that subjectivity incredibly shallow in its resources and its resiliency for affecting what we need in order to respond to this biological threat. I think that's a very telling and important thing. So I agree, and I think I'm suggesting a way we can weave them together.
Yes, and I think the way that we've been talking about philosophy as in the original sense of the word, or the primordial sense of the word, as dialogos, as philosophia, as the process of disclosure of what's beyond and of us. So and having had an experience, and I was telling Chris about this, and this is when I wrote this email for us to get together. I had a circling weekend online, so we're doing everything online now, and it's actually working out like a lot better than I thought it would. And so just basically when you lead a circle, you're basically zeroing in on relevance, basically, just continually finding the sweet spot between chaos and order and relevance, and going up and tracking all the stuff that we're doing. So you're doing that for 10 hours a day. And I got done, and I would imagine all of those yoga stretches. So all my machinery is just, and then I turned on the news. And it was funny because it was, for me anyways, that's the moment where it turned, like where it was like, this became less abstract, went from something kind of abstract to, whoa, this actually could change everybody's life. And in that turn from that state, it was so interesting because I felt myself go, like, take it in, and then back. And I just felt myself go so far back in context to feel into the place to respond from. And in a way that just kept inviting whatever was happening as it was happening. But also I just felt this sense of, like, what am I actually looking at when I'm getting this? What is this crisis that we're talking about exactly? And I got this sense of, I had this feeling of being an ant on the back of an elephant, right? That can see an inch in front of it, that just discovered that it wasn't even an elephant. It didn't know that it was walking on. And then as I started to think about it afterwards, I started thinking about, well, there's probably going to be many phases to this, right? There's the phase that we're in right now, which is the immediacy of the crisis, right? Which I think that you guys have alluded to, where there's a burst of energy and meaningfulness, of importance, because of the change. But I think Chris has alluded to this to this as well, that there's depending on how things go, it seems to me that there's going to be another phase to this, right? Which is actually going to be the revealing of the malaise underneath all the structures that are being shown their instability, right? And are crumbling. And that where that sense of emergency, or our ability to respond, we may not be able to respond in the ways that we always used to. And I have a feeling what we're going to start to do is feel what was concealed in all of everything functioning well, right? This kind of sense of morass, right? And despair and despondency, in the sense of kind of waking up to something that was covered over. And from there, I started to feel into the sense of, wow, maybe right now in the video that John and Chris did with Andrew. Chris, you said something where you were kind of positioning the place that we're in, that maybe this is the time where a philosophical, I wrote it down, a philosophical intervention can take place. And my sense is this whole thing about the religion that's not a religion, Dialogos, and this particular time. And then I heard Jordan, you talk about this notion of is it the campfire or the talking fire?
Yeah, the campfire. Brett's campfire.
Yeah, the Brett's campfire. And I love that image, right? And this idea of what we've been doing so far. Maybe this is the time to really kind of strike around that, is to really start to figure out the constraints, the right constraints for these dialogoses, start to and then distribute them and get them going in this time, such that when that malaise comes in, we'll have something to actually start to be able to with faith go deep into it in a meaningful way, distributed. So I just had a sense of just like, that was my experience of watching the news, and how I've been making sense of it since then, and what had me write the email going, okay, let's meet.
My concern, first of all, the campfire image, I was trying to remember whose it was. One of the people that I was in the group last night, the Rebel Wisdom thing, I believe it was talking about how this medium is very different, because what you get people's faces much closer in some ways. And so if I was if your face was filming me this much of my normal, we'd be extremely close, and it'd be kind of a socially awkward situation probably for us. But because of the way the technology works, the grammar's changed and it's acceptable. We're all, and this goes back to Jordan's point before we start recording, we're all in this weird space where we're all sort of equally close and equally distant from each other. Right? It's a weird space. And so I think one of the things she was bringing up, and then I made a connection to the campfire, was that this is having an impact. It's creating a new grammar of intimacy and relatedness. The medium itself is doing that to a certain degree. And then I suggested, and I couldn't remember the name, so Jordan, thank you for bringing it up. I suggested that what it's doing is it's exacting the thing that's most analogous to us. Maybe this is how Brett came up with the metaphor from our evolutionary history, is when we sat around the campfire. Because in the campfire, we were that close. We were all oriented inward. There was no, right, it was circle, so pretty much equidistant. And because of the way campfires work, our faces are particularly lit, and then everything around us is quickly fading off in the darkness. And Matt Rossano argued, that we've evolved across several species for hundreds of thousands of years to sit around campfires, and that had probably huge selective effects on our cognition. He actually proposes that we gained the capacity for meditation because we sat for generations around campfires. So it's a possibility that this medium is exacting that primordial kind of intimacy, and we haven't had that kind of thing available to us. And it's really interesting the way it juxtaposes something very primordial with something very sort of cutting edge, because this is an emergent technology. And so that's an interesting symbol on it. It's an interesting joining of sort of reaching deep into our ancestry and then pulling us into the precipice of the future. So I think there's something right about that, and I think that's contributing to the kairos. I've been calling them virtual campfires. I don't know what Brett calls them, so I don't want to steal his term. But I have a concern. I think you're right, Guy, that there's a very real possibility that Chris's thesis, that the crisis is causing, very much a reciprocal narrowing for people, a kind of domicide. They're getting into a scarcity mentality, all of these things that, really contribute to threatening meaning in life. And that once all of the urgency is past and we just sort of settle in to survival endurance, I agree that malaise can come forward. I think it's a kairos, though. Sorry, I won't talk too much longer on this, but I think it's a kairos in that, like most kairoses, it's multivalent, it's multi-apt for sending us in many different directions. I think the response we're going to get to it is going to be complex. I think some people, I've already seen the language, and this came up in the discussion with Andrew. The virus also triggers a lot of mythological grammar that's hardwired into us about demonic agents that are ubiquitous in the world and that can strike us in an unpredictable way, and yet we can't see them, and they don't seem to be making, but they may appear, right? And so that sort of mythological nostalgia, I think, is coming up for some people, and that can be reinforced by the fact that we're enforcing a purity code. And so sort of, Old Testament, ubiquitous threatening deity and purity codes, that's hardwired into us in some ways, and we have to be, at least culturally, so we have to be careful. I think that's going to be a real possibility as come back. I think people trying to alleviate the anxiety with premature closure and claiming a certainty of a certain ideological prediction. I think that's going to be another thing that's going to come up. I think people seeking for some kind of integration of those potentially, maybe a somewhat nefarious interconnection in which they propose various kinds of comforting Gnostic-like conspiracy narratives in order to try and alleviate this and give a face to the demon, as well as give us a plan of action for the utopic future. I think all of that, I think those are all very real possibilities, and I see nascent forms of them already taking place. So I think the malaise is going to be interacting with these other factors in a very, 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 and so I think the philosophical task is to be able to engage the philosophia and exemplify it in such a way that we can steer through that complexity. And when I say that, I'm picking up on Jordan's metaphor for the Socratic faith of, surfing the wave of uncertainty, sailing through the storm of uncertainty. So I think we have to be very Socratic about our faith. I think, so I want to add something to what Jordan and I were talking about. It's this integrity and the ability to sense and find the flow, but there's also an element of the Socratic in here, because we're going to get various competing worldviews and ways of life that are kind of come to the fore. And one of the things Socrates does is he doesn't just put a competition of arguments out. He exemplifies a competition of ways of life. Vervaeke makes this argument very clearly. And that's why we have to exemplify what we're doing as much as talk about it. It's like, sorry, I'm not capturing the importance of what I'm trying to convey here, but the Dialogos form is almost as important as anything we're trying to say, because of its capacity for bringing ways of life, or as you put it, Guy, getting worlds into, right, a viable, enacted comparison, so that we can actually not just have a competition in the good sense of the word of arguments, but a competition of ways of life, because that's what we're going to need, I think, to steer through the kairos. And so, Jordan, that's why I'm trying to broaden the notion of faith that we discussed to capture some of this other Socratic element. So that's what I wanted to say about that.
Well, what I'm hearing when you say that, actually, perhaps I'll maybe go back a bit, because there's a few things in the previous conversations that I want to just sort of pluck on the strings with the tone. When the word philosopher is brought up, I feel a Nietzschean desire to distinguish between the bookworm quibbler and that individual who is holding the shamanic lineage in the contemporary environment.
Yep.
So that when we have Brett's campfire invoked, we have the shaman sitting around the campfire playing drums, and we have our modern environment right now.
Yep.
Now, what's interesting about our modern environment is part of the shearing against our systemic dynamics, a very painful shearing, has been the need to bring the virtual into right relationship with the physical. And we are the inheritors of a generation of a confusion. The virtual has been emerging in a very disruptive fashion, but not integrated into a wholeness of life. And of course, as we were mentioned earlier, that we're each of us now feeling this quite deeply. I am at home. I am in a place away from social interaction. Like, my social interaction is very much of two very distinct kinds. There's no confusion. I'm either interacting with my family and with nature, or I'm in the virtual sphere. And there's no in between the two. So that fact creates a really nice crispness of these two very distinct lineages, right? You have actual, literal, biological clan, and you've got complete trans-physical virtual. And they're both like isolated from each other and yet simultaneously occurring. So I suspect that part of the work at the shamanic campfire is to weave together a new psychotechnology that is adequate to actually hold the reality of that relationship. So then the question that came up when you were talking about that juxtaposition of the Socratic conversation, the Dialogos in the context of faith, in the context of surfing. The question I imagine is that who is surfing? As soon as you say, is there something that is somehow hanging in the center that is neither, I think we've already used these terms before, but I apologize, I've lost them. I am not surfing. John is not surfing. When we were in Dialogos, there was someone else who is surfing. And that holding that place in the center is the thing that is surfing, and then simultaneously. So the faith is held by the thing in the center, and we are now in relationship trying to hold that, which is you imagine the physical metaphor of trying to do that while surfing. That's quite an acrobatic feat.
That's exactly right. The logos in the Dialogos.
Yes. The logos is surfing. The logos is that which is of faith. And it is in the co-creation of the logos, and then the feeling of the being pulled along with that surfing. That makes sense if you think about it. Like, that feeling of faith is having an almost uncertainty. You imagine that, when you and I, and now the four of us, increasingly, like, we're beginning to kind of get the rust off the wheels, enter into Dialogos, and then notice that the Dialogos is now off and running on a surfing mission of its own. There's a feeling in each of us of a, how would I say this? An absolute uncertainty. It's not just my uncertainty now. It's actually we uncertainty. So it's two directions, and yet also an embeddedness, like a being pulled along with, being part of something. It's like being in some kind of fluid flowing dance troupe where your individual dance moves are always generated by the dance moves that are around you. And there's something about the invisible hand that's somehow holding everything in place, and you feel held by it, and yet at the same time out of control in the context of it.
That's exactly perfect. I mean, that's what I was trying to get at, but you said it much better than I did. That's what I'm trying to get at, that Dialogos isn't just a pattern of communication. It isn't even just a pattern of cognitive reflective action. It's an exemplification of a way of life. And that's what I'm trying to get at. The notion of faith is linking on one side to this cognitive communicative aspects of Dialogos, but the faith is also, as you said, like Jordan, it's that sense of it's a way of being. This way we are in the Dialogos is the way of being that I think we need to put out there and say, look, this is a really good alternative to these other alternatives that I fear are emerging in the Kairos. That's what I'm trying to get at. The notion of faith is both, a cognitive act, but it's also an existential, right, exemplification, right? My faith is, right, yes, I feel carried along by this, but, right, the Dialogos isn't just something I'm saying. To me, it's giving me a taste of a way of life, a way of being that is, I want to recommend to people right now.
Yes. I'm the being that is at question,
is a question of itself. and faith is, and I want to ask it, right? There's a,
and also,
and I want to take it up.
But the way that what Jordan was saying, though, the way in which presence is the logos, presence is something between us that we are beholden to use your term, Guy, that we're hearkening to, that is educing, that is drawing us along, right? And that I have a sense, right, a participatory sense that is the kind of relationship and the way of being I need in this kairos. That's what I'm trying to say about it's not just what we're saying in the dialogue. It's the dialogue, it's the dialogos itself that is presenting a way of life. That's the Socratic aspect. That's what I'm trying to put my finger on.
Yes. The enacting of it. Yes.
Yes. Yes, very much.
The enacting of it and finding, this is one of the things about the faith for me has always been, and I think this is what you guys are getting at as well. The faith has this element of that when I find myself in the Dialogos, it was already happening and I found myself there. There's that sense of I was participating, right? I got the ball rolling. I showed up for the game and we started to go back and forth. But in some way that was beyond just my doing, I found myself in a flow that is beyond itself, right? But that I find myself inside of at the same time.
Well, because I think the dialectic, insofar as it engenders the dialogos is also we're participating not just in our own cognition.
Yes.
It's conforming us. If it's a way of being and not just a way of communicating, it's conforming us, I think, in important ways to the way reality unfolds. It gets us into a state, that's not even the right word, maybe a mode. It gets us into a mode that conforms us best to reality. That's what, again, it affords the continuity of contact. It doesn't give me particular stable, propositions that I'm going to hold on to. I'm trying to get away from that closure grasping notion of faith. It's rather, no. It puts me into this mode that has me conforming with reality in a way that is conducive, I sense, to my well-being. Chris, you haven't said anything, and that's.
I'm staring into the No. Well, just because this is all good. There's no need to speak when it's better to listen. But all this time, as I'm listening to you guys talk, I'm still staring into the campfire metaphor, and this is really interesting because, I mean, I'm thinking of these virtual campfires, something like a philosophic Decameron. Everyone escapes from Florence into the countryside to flee the Black Plague, and they gather around over a sequence of nights to tell one another stories. But the campfire does something really interesting, because the campfire, the ring of the campfire is like a portal that collapses many worlds in together. And one way in which it does that is the concrete and the virtual. Mm-hmm. The other way it does that, or perhaps by analogy, the inner and outer worlds, which right now in our particular modern predicament, our inner and outer worlds don't meet on the same horizon anymore. That's one of our fundamental problems, right? They're separated. They're like separate lacunas. They don't meet. And there's something about what the campfire does is that it plays host to both the darkness and the light. It plays host to both the interior life of the individual and the communal life of our sociability. And it does that simultaneously. Even if you think about the imagery of a campfire, right? There is only darkness except for the individual faces of the people gathered around it, right? So we are both in solitude and in communion at the same time. One of the things that we're going to have to learn how to do, especially right now, is how to treat ourselves in solitude and how to treat one another in solitude. We're seeing this right now. People don't know how to deal with solitude because we haven't been trained how to deal with solitude. That's why as soon as there's a call for people to cloister themselves, their immediate impulse is to deny the solitude and do their best, sometimes playfully and sometimes amusingly, but still people are doing their utmost to try and avoid the solitude that they've been foisted with. right? To spend every waking hour of their day in conversation with people, right? On the phone, over video, on their balconies, right? I mean, it's becoming like a meme that's circulating, the creative ways in which people are trying to avoid their solitude. But there's a sense in which, playful though that might be, it's actually not helpful, I think, in the long run. At least some iterations of it aren't helpful, because what this affords us is a tutorial for how to treat ourselves in solitude. And the campfire does that beautifully, because the campfire mediates communion and solitude. And I think it does that by collapsing narrativity and what we might call reasoning together as well, right? So there's something about the telling of stories around the campfire and the disclosure, the intimate and personal disclosures that take place around the campfire, that help to collapse the solitude into the world of the social, and then collapse the social into the world of solitude. So there's a nexus point of this virtual campfire, and Dialogo, that's why I think it's such a beautiful, animating metaphor, a mesmeric metaphor, right? We stare into a fire, we're mesmerized by it, right? It's hard to tear your gaze away from it, because it seems to, it's no wonder Heraclitus was so obsessed with it. It seems to disclose reality as you gaze into it. Just as Dialogos seems to do, right? It's equidistant between you. You're all gazing into it, and you're all gazing through it at one another at the same time. So I just find it to be like a really rapturous symbol. And when we understand it as an enactment of the dialogic process, I think we'll find within it, if we can adapt that symbol and place it at the center of a dialogic praxis, it will help us to understand why Dialogos, in the way that we've been discussing it, is such a perfect way of mediating our relationship between the interior life that has gone so uncultivated all this time and the outer life that we are so hopelessly beholden to. Anyway, that's what I've been thinking about.
Sorry, Chris, I shut it over you because there was a gap and I thought you were done.
That's okay. That's what we do.
Because Plato in the seventh letter uses the metaphor of the fire for exactly talking about this kind of dialogos. He says you can't get it just by talking. You have to dwell with people. You have to live with them for a long time, and then a spark catches, and then it takes on. And he talks about how the fire takes on a life of its own, so I think the fire is used by Plato. Probably picking up on the Heraclitean fragment about the universe as a self-kindling fire. The idea that the Dialogos, is very much like a fire, and that it takes on a life of. We put the conditions together, and then it takes on a life of its own, and then it has this function that you're talking about. Very much this function you're talking about. So I'm trying to see if we can make a connection between what you were saying just now and the point I was trying to make, where that Dialogos is very much and the reason why I'm doing that is because Plato brings them together, right? It's not just a conversation. It's not just, you have to live with people. You have to sort of enculturate a way of life, all right? That's part of what makes the Dialogos actually possible. The part of the fuel, if you want, of the Dialogos is not just the conversational, but how people are bringing ways of life together. And I'm wondering how that comports with what you were saying about the bridging between the individual and the collective.
Well, I think if we're to carry the metaphor through of the fire, it does that quite naturally, right? The whole point of the campfire is that people flock to it, precisely because it becomes a refuge for the sort of the darkness that's intrinsic to the world in which people are living at that particular moment. I think the problem is right now that we're seeing is that as this reciprocal narrowing becomes more and more constrictive, and as we retreat more and more and more into our inner lives, we find that we're the source of our own scarcity, right? Like as we retreat into the darkness, we don't find the darkness yields anything. We're not penetrated by it, except in ways that seem pernicious. And so in a way, I think a lot of people are going to find that there is no choice but to seek some kind of communal antidote to that feeling of just the feeling of destitution that happens when you basically have only your subjectivity, like you were saying, John, when you have only your subjectivity left to lean back on, and it reveals itself to be like vapid, then you have to somehow find a way of sharing it in such a way that it's re-imbued with something alive. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is this. I'm as we're retreating further, I'm thinking about this idea. There's I think Augustine talks about the idea of what's it called? An accessio critica, I think it's called, where, the febrile state, the fever, the fever is actually worse. The state of illness is actually worse the more distant we are from recovery, and yet it feels better the more distant we are from recovery. And as we get closer and closer and closer to recovery, the fever seems to become worse and worse and worse and worse.
Right.
And so as that happens, and we retreat closer and closer and closer to the center of that sense of darkness that becomes so crippling, then Dialogos, just as a fire is in a primordial darkness, becomes the refuge that in our solitude we can flock to, right? But we have to, it's as though we have to get to a particular point of desperation, of material desperation, before that becomes somehow a live option to most people. I mean, we've entered into it voluntarily and quite happily, but it's not top of mind for most people. And it's as though we have to get to a point where the material, where our material resources are sufficiently exhausted, when the physicians have exhausted their use and we have nothing to turn to, it's at that point that the dialogic campfire becomes the thing that rekindles, no pun intended, that rekindles our attention, because it's only at that point that it will start to be salient enough to most people to be taken seriously, to be taken as something of value.
But that's also the point where the alternatives I've talked about are also going to become more salient too, right?
Yes, which is why it's going to be in competition with a lot of pseudo-religious and ideological thinking, the likes of which we've talked about already, right?
I wouldn't say, by the way, we came here sort of willingly. John and I met in the context of him putting a lot of personal time into doing a large series around the meaning crisis, which is a diagnosis of the fact that shit's fucked up. And I think sort of all of us have been, to a greater or lesser extent, guided by both a theoretical and embodied sense of the reality of that being the case. I certainly would much prefer to smoke dope and play with my kids than to be endeavoring to throw myself into the campfire. But nonetheless, I feel that, as you say, the rains have not come in many years, and though the watering hole has served us well, it may be time to uproot and try to cross the valley in search of a new watering hole. So the code is activated, telling us, what do we do in these times? What do we do in the times when the old ways clearly are no longer working? Very bad times indeed when the old ways don't work, because making new ways is a hard thing to do. And as you say, it's the space, the moment, the meeting between the interior and the exterior, the meeting between the self and the communal, the place where that line is. That's what we would normally call culture. And the co-creative aspect of culture is this relationship between the individual and the collective. And when you zoom back into that campfire, the locus, the loci, the focus, where the code writing end point of culture is actually at, is when you've actually come to the conclusion in the embodied sense of the self and the collective that this is the place that we can be and the only place we can be. Reality, of course, will send us there, like it or not. It keeps getting broken if you don't fix it. So here we are, and I agree with you that there are phases to this thing. The phases have a certain like a face to them. Everybody gets a chance to look in the mirror that they need to see. If one thing didn't get you, another one will. I noticed that friends of mine for whom the notion of virus meant nothing are paying very close attention to the losing of their bank accounts on the part of modern robber barons. There will be more.
Yeah. Perhaps I could say something that might bridge, and it's also picking up on the fire, because ultimately the fire is not only functional, the fire is beautiful in the way it wraps our attention. And what and Jordan and you and I talked about this. The part of the Sengstock faith is the project of beautifying right? We're trying to make beautiful. We're trying to get the salience landscaping to make, and this is, this is clearly part of Plato's strategy too. There's a kind of beautification that's going on that makes the way of life that you find in Dialogos beautiful to people. And I'm wondering what we can do. Sorry, I keep putting this in terms of sort of a responsibility question, but what we can do to beautify Dialogos so that it becomes an attractive way of life and an attractive way of connecting and cultivating shared meaning, culture, so that it can have its chance against these potential competitors. What does that actually mean? What does the project of trying to bring beauty into this actually mean?
Well, for one, I noticed that there's a large amount of background noise going on.
Oh, I'm having a plumbing crisis, so the plumber's here. Hang on, I'll put it on mute.
But I noticed that's actually was a very, for me at least, it was as you were speaking, I was noticing in myself, I was okay, listen to the aesthetic sense. Is there anything in my aesthetic sense that's being called up? And part of what was being called up was, oh, wow, I'm paying very close attention to John, but there's actually a lot of noise going on in the background. And there's something about that there's a heaviness, a weight. The clarity isn't available in this context. Is there some way of using that sense to notice where the noise is? Is there a way to shift our relationship with that noise so we can actually get to a place where the clarity, which oftentimes is very difficult to get a hold of, is given the space?
Say more, Jordan. That sounds really cool.
Oh, gosh, do I have any more to say?
You're talking about a kind of reframing that's trying to open up a way of clarifying and making it appealing in some ways.
Like an aesthetic, is it like an aesthetic seduction almost that you're talking about, Jordan? Like to beautify the process, to make it attractive from without to people whose eye it hasn't already caught?
Absolutely. I mean, I think in some sense, if we just sort of invite the feminine into this conversation, we'll know what we're talking about.
Right.
If you want to actually have this thing happen, that's the way to do it. Everyone feels in themselves the attraction to that which is most needful. If you can allow that to seduce us into right action, then we're there very happily. That becomes the joyful interaction.
That's really cool. So is that back to, the finesse that between vulnerability and exposure that Guy talks about? Because I'm thinking, Jordan, you and I talked about sort of maybe I'll say an anti-aesthetic, in which people try to catharsis. They try to transform the anxiety into fear, which gives them a clear, distinct object, and they can discharge it. But that actually isn't to respond to the fear. Whereas, right, it might be instead, right, there's a way of responding to the noise of anxiety in the way you're talking about here. Does that land at all? What I'm trying to get at?
Yeah, I think there is something there. It's something. This is worth. Let's just. I feel like contemplating it for a while.
Sure.
I imagine we've all been seduced. I would hope so. If not, I recommend it. And there's something in that is exactly what you were speaking about when you talked about I think it was the vulnerability
and exposure.
I talked
about, I was thinking that maybe there's a parallel, right, between, anxiety and, but if you can sort of so a positive transformation might be to transform, this is very pertinent to me personally, to transform exposure into vulnerability, where vulnerability is a kind of probative sensitivity as opposed to a sense of being harmed or cut in some fashion.
I would say that more than any of the reasons that I actually stated, the reason why I wanted to get together is because what happens here is beautiful.
It is, but
in an aspirational way, in a way that actually, in a way that I anticipate being so, in a way that I know without knowing it. there's a way where I think that there's that quality of beauty that inherently involves concealment and withdrawal and coming into concealment. That and there's something about, at least for me, these conversations and reading philosophy and doing circling and all of the mystical traditions and everything I've ever even done any remotely like this, that I think the thread through all of it has to do with awakening the sense that there is more than meets the eye. There's more than that's being heard, but I can begin to orient my attention to that which isn't here, but could be here, or reach into that sense of as you often talk about, John, is that sense of moreness, like the fountainhead of intelligibility. And there is, and I really like this notion of seduction, right? And the sense of, because there is a quality of it, really does strike me as, you know, when my wife does something beautiful and she just looks at me a particular way, there's a way where you can't capture her. You can't make that happen. You're in relationship to it. You can dance around it. You can be present. But when she opens, right? And there's always a sense of being, when she does, a deep gratitude and a sense of being subordinate to her. So I really like this quality. I do think that the attractor, right? The attractor is the beautiful. And I do notice that, like in my experience with circling, you know, which has a lot to do with people experiencing other people and themselves being vulnerable. And there's a volunteer, like the difference between exposure and invulnerability has to do with being a volunteer, right? So it's like, you know, it's the difference between I'm in the playground and somebody comes up behind me and pulls my pants down. I didn't sign up for that, but all of a sudden, like my most vulnerable parts of me are exposed to the world in a way that I wouldn't have volunteered for, right? There's that sense of exposure, where vulnerability is more that sense where I'm actually something scary, yet I see something valuable enough glows bigger than that fear, and such I courageously disclose myself to it. And I notice that when people witness other people do that, it is almost impossible not to fall in love with that person. It's almost impossible not to be moved. There's just that experience of watching somebody stretch and reach and fumble, voluntarily being awkward in the face of something that could be so painful if it doesn't work out, right? And to do that voluntarily is a revelation of, I think, what is most beautiful in us.
But I want to pick up on that, though, because and the two things you talked about, because I don't think this contradicts you, Guy, but I want to put it in sort of like into dialogue, because what strikes me about beauty is exactly what I just said. Beauty strikes us. We're struck by it, right? And there's it's almost like beauty is it's retrospective, voluntary. Like I'm carried into it, and it's almost like you said before, and I find myself already in it, and I retrospectively say, I've been carried here, sort of against my will, if you'll allow me that, but I assent to it completely, right? You know, so I'm given a moment of choice in beauty, where I find I'm being carried along by some kind of logos. And that's a moment of faith. That's a moment of, no, I accept. I'm being carried by this, and I accept it. And it's precisely because, because it's beautiful. That seems to me to be part of the phenomenology of beauty. And Scary, in her book, beauty and justice, she says that capacity for beauty, she says, she's trying to do a thing with the true, the good, and the beautiful. She says our encounter with beauty is where we get our primary training, and this is the aspirational part, right? It's where we get our primary training for truth and justice. Because unless we can be struck by something outside of our ego perspective and come to be drawn into accepting it, we're incapable of the truth. We're incapable of the truth. We need that primary ability to, this took me by surprise, and yet I accept it, right? Right?
I'm feeling this gathering. Yes, I'm feeling something gathering in the conversation. I'm starting to feel myself circle around in this.
And then she talks about how that also prepares us for justice, because what it does for us is it makes us realize that certain things are deserving of our attention, in the way that Albertus talks about in The Sovereign. It's the opposite of the subjectivity of attention, right? It's an inversion that these things, the project is to make myself relevant. These things are deserving of my attention, not because of some egocentric project, but precisely because they are beautiful, right?
That,
and we need,
that right there, that involvement, like it's deserving of my attention, and I'm involved, right? There's that quality of it's revealed, and I'm revealed, I'm co-revealed.
Yes,
right?
And that's the love.
Yeah.
Right? That co-revelation is the love. So this is what I mean about how there's a deep connection. And, Jordan, of course, was obviously alluding to it. Plato compares getting into philosophy to seduction. And the seduction metaphor is rife through the Platonic dialogues, right? Especially in the encounter with Alcibiades, for example. And so this is what I mean about the way beautification, like it gets us into it. It draws us into a way of life by starting to train us for truth, and new justice, right? In powerful ways.
Yeah, I was noticing a movement in that direction between the salient and the relevant in that context, right?
Yeah.
And I was actually then contemplating the evolutionary story, right? The evolutionary theory behind the nature of what we consider to be beautiful.
Yes.
That over a very long period of time, that which was a likely good choice is what we would come to receive as beautiful.
Right.
In all ways, and everything that we could ever of our entire relevance realization project for 13 billion years has been honed to get the capacity to actually make effective choices in the context of that which is perceived as most beautiful.
Mm-hmm. So the maybe part of what Dialogos does, Plato considers this in the Symposium, right, is what it does is it takes us through sort of stages of aspirational acceptation. We take sort of a basic, sexual ability, and then we exact it into epistemic, and then we exact it into existential, and perhaps we then exact it into something profoundly ontological, because Plato talks about that capacity, right?
Think about how it's intrinsically holistic. It's an integrative sense. It's an integrative sense of discernment. Right? You actually cannot help but, if you don't have the whole of it, like you're playing music. Yeah. Use that metaphor. You're playing guitar, and you're not playing a script. Right? You're not playing a song. You're playing from the sense of feeling. Right. If you are fully in it, right, you're allowing the whole of yourself to just melt into the sensing of it, and all you do is feel that aspect of it, which is yearning to be the most beautiful move that can be made right now. You are making beautiful music. Right. And exactly to the degree to which you either back away from an aspect of yourself, or you've reached the limits of the capacity to be wholly in relationship with the possibilities that are emerging moment to moment, is in fact the end and the limit of your capacity to make beautiful. Mm-hmm. This is the appropriate modality for considering questions of the sort that we're considering.
Yes.
We have to be coming from an integrative wholeness and be feeling into the right way of making steps in a place where we can't analytically break this thing down. It's hopelessly complex. Every move implicates everything else in ways we can't possibly understand.
This is the inactive integrity you often point towards in these discussions of faith. Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely.
It's interesting. Go ahead, Chris. I've said a lot.
I was going to say this is also the difference between the two versions of the philosopher that you were talking about at the very beginning, Jordan. Mm-hmm. one who is circumscribed by constraints that usually eliminate and exclude the artistic, that sort of gilds philosophy with the aesthetic attractiveness that ultimately begins the process of that seduction, right? Because right now I think it's almost as though the artistic project and the philosophic project need to be revalorized to one another, to be reintegrated after so many years of being at quits. And I think if it's that marriage is so essential to being able to, for the holism that you're talking about. I think that marriage is so essential, and one of the things that we struggle right now to resolve.
Wow, yeah. I think about this. I mean, we have these cycles between the shaman and the chief, between the philosopher, poet, and the king. We have that individual who plays the role of, I suppose, the scholar, who acts as the weapon that the king uses to hold back the power of the philosopher, poet. And in some cases, this is most needful because, for God's sakes, philosopher, poet is very dangerous to the status quo. The creative impulse is disruptive. But there are moments that come, like the moment that we're in, when quite obviously the king has become the old king, filling the Babylonian myths right now.
Oh yeah, you're enacting it.
Where the time has come for that transition to actually become fully bursting forth. And now the calling is to actually recognize the philosopher poet and the full creative potential to be reawakened. And then, of course, as you say, it's the artistic impulse, the ability to actually to make beautiful music, to hear the song of the angels, to hear the music of the spheres, that thing out of which creativity literally weaves a new possibility into reality. That's where we are, right? We're in the moment of the breakdown of the old actuality, which puts us at the threshold of the necessity of reweaving a new possibility into reality.
Yes.
Well said.
Part of what it would be then, again, is that Dialogos, right, the dialogic form exemplifies exactly that kind of synthesis, right? Right? And I think particularly, I think I was talking to you about this, Jordan, about well, maybe it was also in the discussion with Andrew, Chris, I can't remember. This is one of the things I deeply admire about Chris. I mean, I find this in all of you guys, but I find that Chris, and that's why I love hanging out with you guys, but I find this particularly in Chris, the way he weaves poetry and philosophy together, I think is exemplary for what we're talking about right now. I think the way he does that is really, really central and important.
Thank you for that, John. I mean, it's an interesting thing because it's not, finding a venue for it is not easy, right? And one of the things that we're contending with and trying to resist is are the multiple sets of constraints that, I mean, as you were talking about, our particular state of actuality that ultimately needs to be subject to a kind of artistic dissolution in order to be reborn into something of possibility, of a possibility that becomes navigable. And that's a hard thing to do when the very structures that are meant to foster and equilibrate us are also the things that circumscribe that same kind of creativity, that prevent that same synthesis. And I think that's why it's so easy to be at a loss. That's why it's so easy to be at a loss, is because it has to be nurtured from without. It can be kindled from within, but it has to be nurtured from without. And that's, again, to your point, John, about the importance of the dialogic process is so important precisely because it requires the tutoring. It requires the loving from without and the tutoring from without. It requires us. We must first be seen in potentia in order to actually then reach out into the actual. Those two things have to wed properly, and it's very difficult for that to happen if it's not called out from something or someone beautiful, right? Because it's not just that we have to behold beauty. It's that we have to be beholden by the beauty. We have to be called out by the beauty, right? Well, yeah. I liken it to that feeling of you're looking at someone attractive from afar, and then they look at you, and it's like, whoa, look at that, right? Because all of a sudden you're outside of yourself immediately, just struck. Like that. Yeah. You're struck, but it's not. But it's being struck by beauty requires activity if I can put it that way, on the part of the beauty, right?
Yes. Yes.
There's an agency of the beauty. It's not passive. It's not like a kind of Aristotelian passivity. We sort of move around it, but it doesn't move, right? It's no. It reaches to us as we reach out to it. And then I love that and I love the way that you articulated that, John, that we're sort of born by the Logos. And then in the process of being born by the Logos, we consummate the journey with the choice to undertake the journey, even as it's already undertaken, right? Therein lies the challenge, though. Therein lies the challenge, because if we can't, that goes back to the fundamental problem we started with the subjectivity, the barrenness of the subjectivity that can't reach into itself and also can't reach out of itself, is that it needs to be lifted. At least it needs to be lifted from without, in some sense.
I think I'm hearing us start to get at. I think I'm hearing what we're saying is distinguishing there's an integrity within or of beauty.
Yes.
And the structures that you're talking about, that there is an integrity. So I think I heard someone said that all possibility, right, sits on top of integrity. Right? If there's no integrity, there goes possibility. They're very, very wedded. And so what I'm hearing are the conditions of possibility of beauty. And that's just where I notice my listening is sinking into here.
Yeah, because it's a beauty that that's right, Guy. Because it's a beauty that recognizes beauty.
But that's what Plato says.
It's a beauty cognizant of beauty. Yeah, well, I'm thinking about, because we just read it the other day.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the beginning of the Alcibiades, where, Socrates butters Alcibiades with flattery for a few minutes. I mean, not only is Socrates attractive unto himself, right, because he's Socrates, but he butters Alcibiades and beautifies him before his own eyes. And there's something about the way he beautifies him before his own eyes that actually attracts him and entreats him into the dialogic process. Because he plays this very careful game, right? He does that thing he does. He sort of flatters him and insults him at the same time, right? He strokes his potential, but reveals his lack simultaneously. And it's that combination, I think, that's that's the alchemical combination right there. It's you have the form within you, right? You have the soul of eternity within you. You have the divine spark and the pneuma, but it's unpronounced. So you need my help to pronounce it. So let's begin the pronunciation. And somehow that both of those things together seem to be required in that aesthetic. That aesthetic and treatment.
It's because it's engendering the two parts of eros, right? It's giving you the sense of direction, but the sense of lack at the same time, right? Which is what you need. I mean, and that goes back to, I think, to Scary's point about how it opens us up to the truth that we don't have, right? And that has. But I'm wondering, given that, because you're talking about, Plato talks about. The response to beauty, the real response to beauty. And here I'm trying to connect back to Jordan's notion of an active integrity, an active integration. The response to beauty is the impulse to make beauty, like to generate beauty, right? So Plato sees that the true experience of beauty is you want to give birth to beauty, right? It's only when you're in conformity and wanting to give birth that you've actually encountered, and that's how he's trying to contrast beauty with just something that gives us pleasure, right? And then I'm wondering how this intersects with the two epistemologies that have tended to sort of warp this. There's, as you said, Chris, there's a kind of empiricism that just excludes this completely. And then there's a romanticism that just says, no, beauty is something that I express, I press onto the world. And what it does is disclose my subjectivity. Rather than calling me beyond it, it discloses it in powerful ways. Now, I want to say right clearly, that's a bit of a caricature of romanticism. That's what I would call decadent romanticism. There's obviously individual romantics that move very significantly from what I've disclosed. But I think it's fair to say that it's definitely a widely disseminated and accepted cultural pattern around a romantic misinterpretation of beauty that is holding us in thrall to a very, very significant
like where beauty lost its integrity somehow and stopped.
Yeah, because
possible.
what we're doing is we're taking credit. we're taking credit for it. It's like the Heideggerian technologization of beauty. It's in service to us, right? Rather than we are in service to it. It's not that it's my subjectivity is deserving of attention, not the beautiful itself.
Yeah, that's right. And then in the inverse of that, the inverse of that problem is then the worshipfulness, right?
Yeah.
The idolatrous worship of beauty.
Yes,
right?
yes,
Which is the inverse of the narcissistic problem.
Yes,
of its subjective valorization.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you can think about a lot of interesting things that come out of that. It has to do with the failure to close the generative origin and source of the purpose and meaning of beauty. Right? It's, again, if we think about it from an evolutionary perspective, a landscape is beautiful because to venture into that landscape is bountiful.
Mm-hmm.
Once we've made it an artifact, do not actually close with it. A woman is beautiful because ultimately she will give birth to beautiful children, right? We actually don't actually go through the entire loop and come all the way to the end and play it all the way through as a generative enactment, we've done something which is deeply in violation of the thing that got us here. So I think there's a powerful warning in that.
So we got to awaken. We've got to bring to the fore that Dialogos, the beautification within Dialogos, is trying to get us to give birth to a new way, a new world.
Right.
That's
to honor it is to listen to it, and to listen to it is to be drawn into it. To be drawn into it is to be both resourced, but also to be challenged. Give birth to that which is calling us.
Yes, very much. So the Socratic midwifery goes to being not only something between people, but also between people and the world.
Yes.
And then between people and themselves.
Yes, totally. Of course, Chris. Yes, the deep interconnection between Socratic self-knowledge, not autobiographical self-knowledge, but Socratic self-knowledge and the ability to do this. Yeah, that I think that's a deeply important point you just put your finger on. That shouldn't be excluded, because that is the alternative to subjectivity, right? Socratic self-knowledge, which sets you into the aspiration to be other than you are, is the opposite of subjectivity.
Yeah.
Mm.
Even Socrates, yes. Even Socrates isn't like Socrates.
Famously so, but famously he's a topos, right? You can't put him into a category. He constantly is metaxu. He's intercategorical, both horizontally and aspirationally, and also ontologically. He's intercategorical.
Mm-hmm. Which is why he's both subject and object to Eros, right? You want Socrates and you want to be Socrates simultaneously, right? Which helps to then obviate the possibility that you become worshipful in the wrong sense of his beauty.
Oh, and that's Girard's notion, right? Girard's notion about the malevolent mimesis, that envy and covetousness are it's the dark side of admiration, right? That instead of wanting to aspire to be like Socrates or to be like Christ, one wants to consume them into one's subjectivity. One wants to subject them completely to one's ego.
Yeah, and I was talking with Nora Bateson this morning, and she was pointing out that the present context creates the situation that in relationship to identity, it's a bit like being a gingerbread man made of certain sort of low viscosity goo that happens to still have the mold on it.
Right.
And then you pull the mold away. And it begins to ooze out of its shape. We've become so accustomed to alienating ourselves into a context that is not of our own making, and to imagine that context, the shape of the form that we've actually adapted to, is in fact the shape of ourselves rather than the shape of the form that we've adapted to. That when willy-nilly that form has gone away, we're in a rather uncomfortable state. But the discovery of the conversation here, which by the way is also more or less the discovery that I was having with her in a different set of words, was that the Dialogos, the relationality of the conversation and the space that can be held around the campfire is precisely the container to enter into when you're in that goo. When the goo is flowing, that's where you want to be.
So beautify the goo.
And the draw of that, the sort of how do I say this, the unbearableness of being alone in the goo. pulls you into the necessity of finding your way into the campfire, no matter how hard that might be. And then in simply discovering how to rediscover the capacity to resolve the interior, it's not even ennui, it's stronger than that, the horror of being shapeless in the context of the goo, builds the context, build the capacity in Dialogos that gives rise to the objective. The objective follows the necessity to create a context that allows the subjective, which again is the crucible of culture. So it's as we discover the way to actually be capable of holding our true selves, ourselves in openness and liminality, and only with each other in a particular style of relationship. As we become capable of that, we discover that we are also creating the exterior. We are migrating our way inside and outside to this new place.
So if Socrates' capacity to beautify the intercategorical in that way, right? Isn't that doing? He's exemplifying the recommendation, right? He's taking. That's what I meant when I shouted out. I'm sorry, I got very like beautifying the goo. He is showing that when you're shapeless, that can be re-understood as a Socratic project, a Socratic virtue. That's a better word. A Socratic virtue of being right, able to be move between the categories, give birth, be the symbolon that joins the world together.
That's right. Yes, it's very uncomfortable to be the goo, but as soon as you awaken to the fact that you're in fact a polymorphic, that shapelessness is your natural condition, and it allows you to become like water, then you've rediscovered the true power of who you are.
And the willingness to be the goo seems like the question of vulnerability, like the willingness to dissolve into that which could flow in and out of categories and find out who I am in the next moment. And the faith, so if we look at the faith that I enact in doing that, right, is, I don't know, is the right word, it rests on, what is the faith such that allows me to be able to be goo-able?
Goo-bile.
Yeah, but because I think we're at a time right now where I keep thinking of James Bond right now, of like there's so much urgency going on, right? But the last thing that we need is a bunch of urgent people, right? Like what we need is a lot of people who are really resting deeply, that can, you know, James was making a martini while he's like like saving the world, and whatever that sense is of the faith especially, I think maybe in this time, is calling forth an equanimity from us, right? In the presence of danger, because in so many ways, I just noticed me attempting to look at how, what can I do here right now? What can I do here right now in relationship to this? Is goo like, right?
Yeah.
It turns to goo. So I'm just I think I'm walking myself back into this sense of, what is it that I have faith in, or such that I'm goo-able voluntarily.
And that gooability you're talking about, Guy, it's like it kind of lays the conditions, almost surreptitiously lays the conditions for gnosis, because it's like you're relaxing into the indistinctness as to be informed by that indistinctness, in a Neoplatonic sense of being informed by the indistinctness. It's kind of a certain, like an ontological impressionability to dispose before the newfound uncertainty of reality, and then as we sink into the depths of that indistinctness, the affordances for its potential begin to occur to us, precisely because we've allowed ourselves to slacken into the indistinct state. There is a repose in that. There is an interesting kind of philosophic repose to be found in that. And I think maybe that's what we're trying to refer to. In this and in a couple of other recent conversations any number of us have had, I've been sensing this tone of like, well, actually, I'm feeling rather good, not good in the sense of, not to trivialize the state of suffering that many people are in at all, but there's a certain, it's not a respite, but it's a kind of cautious and interested alertness that we've all been provoked into, and I think that those states are somewhat aligned in this case.
Can I offer a term from outside the Platonic tradition that struck me when you said that, Chris? So in Tai Chi Chuan, you're after a state Peng.
Ah, yeah.
Right? Which is this state. So like my arm isn't limp and it's not rigid. And the metaphor is imagine that there's water flowing through my arm. So it could it has force to it. It's right. But at the same time, it has suppleness to it, and it has adaptivity to it. And you're always trying, like you're trying to have Peng. Sometimes I do the immovable arm with people, like they have their arm like this, and you try and bend it. It's usually very easy to bend it, and then you say, okay, imagine that there's water flowing through your arm, like really quite powerfully, and people will find that because what it does is it sort of gets you much more sophisticated coordination, that imagery. And what happens with that sophisticated coordination is their arm becomes immovable, but it also simultaneously feels more alive and supple to them. And so that's Peng. And it sounds to me like what we're talking about, all right, is that we're trying to get we're trying to Peng our goo so that we can be struck by beauty and open to the world.
Well, we should also mention the other side of it, is that the immovable arm becomes the thing that can do anything in the world.
Yes, exactly. It's multi-apt. That's the whole point, right? The whole point of it is it's this nexus point between force and flexibility. It has tremendous receptivity, but also a tremendous capacity for redirecting, which is part of what we need in the kairos, right? We have to receive it. We've been talking a lot about the receiving, but what Peng brings is we also need the ability to redirect, right? Properly. Yes.
Yep. That's exactly it. Now, what I'm noticing is also then the context of the changing state of context. We've talked about this a few times. There's a pace. The world is moving faster, just changing more rapidly. And I've often said this in very close conversations, that the challenge has very little to do with how do I say this right? Overcome, or let's go with overcome the structures that we currently find ourselves engaged with. Human-built structures. That's actually not the challenge. We don't need to convince or move or change or break. Reality, its changing fastness, the velocity of change will destroy those structures. They cannot stand before it. The only challenge is to achieve this place that you called Peng.
Yeah.
If we can achieve that, if we can become the immovable arm, that and that alone is that which can endure that in context anyway.
Yes.
It's as simple as that.
Right. Right. So that's the kind of integrity you're talking about too. Peng is the kind of integrity you're trying to articulate. Is that fair, Jordan?
That's right. So it's really an invitation. It's just an invitation to become part of that only kind of way of being, the only possible way of being that could in fact long endure the context into which we are for sure entering. Anyone who wants to survive must do that. It's as simple as that.
So as we're talking, I keep seeing through this metaphor of sitting at the fire and us, and then noticing the darkness behind us and the glow on your face, and listening and hearing you describe, like as you were moving your hands and talking about this, having you describe, like, out there, if you go like this and if you go like this, and you just, the invitation is out there, like the sense of the darkness beyond us is almost like we're leaning in, talking about how to be there, right? How to, in the darkness, opening up and becoming distinct. And it's really interesting how pertinent that symbol is I'm seeing through that symbol and with that symbol here.
Can I just go beyond almost? I would like to formally and officially propose that is how we should be out there.
Yes.
And what's interesting is precisely how, again, if you'll allow me, if we're Tai Chiing into the darkness, you have the moving Peng, but it's also it's attractive, it's beautiful, right? It's beautiful.
Exactly.
And therefore liable to be imitated.
Yes,
Lends
exactly.
itself to imitation.
Oh,
Exactly. But the correct kind of mimesis, not the malevolent, consumptive mimesis, but the aspirational mimesis.
and an invitation to become a part of, to become a full participant, symmetric participant in all ways, because the Pong loses all integrity the moment it falls out of that.
Yes, exactly.
So the darkness has occurred for me as we've been sitting here. It went from some version of opaque and not something to go towards to glimmering, shimmering, beautiful.
Because that's
Something-
that. Sorry, Guy.
I hope I'll accept your apology, but only fully
Sorry,
and completely.
Didn't mean to
long as
cut
you
across
talk
you there. I mean, that's because I was just going to riff off of what you just said. I mean, that's what happens as the spirit, as it were, of the campfire becomes hosted by each of the participants that gather around it. The darkness itself becomes gilded, right? The darkness itself is befriended. And so its presence stops being a source of disquiet and starts to become a presence of that moreness. That's what happens as we sink into the dialogic fire, that the darkness penetrates us, but it penetrates us in a way that envelops us into the moreness that only darkness can portend.
Something alchemical going on.
Somebody out there tagged the last 33 minutes and 30 seconds. That was some seriously good shit. Just tag it. Just write it down. Somebody can click on it. If you don't want to watch all the rest of the crap we just did, grab that.
Like I say, I accept your apology. There's a sense in which I'm getting, there's a certain obviousness that's glowing through everything of well, why Dialogos? Why do this? Like this was exemplified that for me.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was trying to call us to in this dialogue.
It's a great job.
Is to like, and this is a feature that Chris and I talk about in Dialogos. One of the skills of dialectic as a psychotechnology is to constantly move between explicating it, like we're doing conceptually, and then exemplifying it, right, modally. And we're constantly moving between those. Like is the way it constantly rebounds between us. Where, it goes within and without and between. Like we say something and then we rebound, and then it starts to get exemplified. And that to me is very attractive. It really draws me and fascinates me because it harkens to what Chris said. It harkens to a potential me and us that can respond to the depths of the darkness.
And as the darkness descends, the campfire becomes all the more attractive. And the late night, the cold weather, standing around the campfire, telling stories just to keep ourselves warm and awake, to keep it stoked, so everyone else can have warmth and have a campfire to find as they wander through the darkness.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Well, guys, I feel complete.
Me too. I'm very happy with how this unfolded.
Me too.
What it came to.
Me too.
Yeah, I feel better.
Yeah.
I
feel.
I'm going to use this adjective, and I hope people can resonate with everything I'm trying to convey by it. I found this genuinely lovely.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I feel moved and whole. There's a sense of wholeness.
Yeah.
A fullness.
Hmm.
And
John,
in their silence also, like I felt like as we were just being silent, I could listen to it as like it was a pregnant fullness for me.
Which
I felt
often
like I
happens
could,
on the campfire. After the stories,
yeah,
people all fall into silence, and they're
Mhm.
reverberating around the campfire.
yeah. Mhm.
John, I really appreciate the wholesomeness of this project of recovering all these good old-fashioned words and returning them into coinage.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But it's kind of the opposite of Diogenes. He said he wanted to deface the currency, and I'm trying to reface things,
Mhm.
so that we may better face things. If
Yeah.
you'll allow me a bit of a pun,
Yeah.
Nice.
that's what I'm trying to do.
Mm.
So thank you for saying that, Jordan. It means a lot to me that you recognize that.
Yeah, definitely. And just thank you for being more and more possessed by the right thing.
And
There's a madness to it, and
Yeah.
I've always appreciated that about you.
Well, thank you.
Mhm.
All right, guys. See you around. See you at the
Okay.
next campfire.
You got it.
Take care
Right.
and stay
Look forward
safe.
to it.
Oh.
And stay safe.